The horse was going to kill somebody before the week was out. Cord Hallett knew it the same way he knew when rain was coming, somewhere deep in the meat of his shoulders, in the old ache behind his left knee where a bull had stepped on him 14 years prior. He stood at the fence rail in the grey half-light of a September morning, watching the black stallion pace the far end of the corral like something that had never made peace with being caught. The animal's nostrils were wide and red. His hooves tore divots in the earth with the kind of fury that had no name. Cord had bought the horse from a man in Laredo who smiled too much. He should have read that as a warning. The stallion, he'd named him Ezra. After an uncle who also had no use for peace, had thrown 2 of Cord's ranch hands in 3 days and put a third one against the fence posts hard enough to crack 2 of his ribs. The man had collected his wages and his dignity and ridden east without a goodbye. The ranch itself sat at the bottom of a long, slow valley in the New Mexico territory, where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains kept their distance but watched everything. The land was dry in ways that felt personal. The sun came up each morning not so much rising as attacking, burning the color from the sky until everything, rock, scrub. The old wooden structures of the Hallett place turned the pale amber of old bone. Cord was 41 years old. He had a bad knee, 17 head of cattle, and a horse that wanted no part of any arrangement he'd made with the world. That was the morning Clara Voss came down the road with her 2 children and a wagon that looked held together by prayer and friction. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The wagon came slow, one wheel groaning against its axle with every rotation, a sound like something asking to be put out of its misery. Cord watched it from the fence rail, one boot hooked on the lower rung, his coffee grown cold in his hand. He did not know the woman driving it, but he recognized the way she held the reins, tight at the knuckles, arms slightly too rigid. The posture of a person holding a great many things together through nothing but will. Beside her on the bench sat a boy, maybe 10 or 11, with his mother's set jaw and eyes that had seen more than they should have. In the wagon bed, curled under a canvas that had mostly given up on being waterproof, was a small girl. She was asleep or pretending to be. Either way, she was smart about it. The woman stopped the wagon at the gate. She looked at Cord, and Cord looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a beat. "You Hallett?" she finally asked. "I am. Clara Voss. My place is the Braddock Spread," was the Braddock Spread. 3 miles northeast of here. She paused. "I heard you needed someone who knows horses." Cord set his coffee down on the top fence rail. "Who told you that?" "Mervyn at the feed store said your last hand left. Said the reason why." She glanced at Ezra, still pacing, still furious. "I've gentled horses before." Cord looked at her hands. The knuckles were scarred in the particular way that came from roping and fence work, not kitchen work. Her coat was a man's coat, too large at the shoulders, the hem frayed. "Where are you coming from?" he asked carefully. She did not flinch, but something behind her eyes went very quiet. "Away from," she said. "If that's enough for now." It was enough. Cord had his own history of moving away from rather than toward, and he'd learned not to hand that kind of stone back to a person. "There's a bunkhouse," he said. "It's got 2 rooms. Used to be 4 men. Now it's empty." The boy straightened up on the bench. Clara Voss looked at the bunkhouse, then back at Cord, measuring something she didn't say out loud. "In exchange for work," he added. "Not charity." "I don't take charity," she said, and the way she said it, flat and final as a lid going on a box, told him it was a rule she'd built her spine around. She climbed down from the wagon herself before he could offer a hand, which he had not quite decided to offer anyway. The boy, his name was Thomas, Cord would learn, jumped down behind her and went to check on the girl in the wagon bed. The girl's name was June. She was 7. She woke up and looked at Cord with eyes the precise color of creek water after a storm. "Does that horse bite?" she asked. "Yes," Cord said. Good, she said, apparently satisfied, and climbed out of the wagon on her own. The bunkhouse was a disaster. Cord had not lied about that. He had not bothered to lie about most things for years, which had cost him socially and gained him nothing obvious in return, but he held to the practice anyway. There were 2 broken cots, a stove that needed its flue cleaned, a window with a cracked pane stuffed with rags, and a smell that was equal parts mildew, boot leather, and old tobacco. Clara looked at it for a long moment. "I've had worse," she said. She set the children to work immediately, Thomas sweeping, June stacking the split wood that was piled in a disordered heap along the outside wall, and she herself started on the stove. Pulling the rags from the flue with bare hands, wiping each joint with a rag she'd brought from the wagon, checking the drawer with practiced efficiency. By midday the flue was clear and the stove was lit, and Cord found himself standing in the doorway of his own main house trying to remember what he was supposed to be doing. He settled on making supper. Cord was not a man of many skills in the kitchen, but he was honest about what he could do. He had dried beans and salt pork and cornmeal and half a sack of onions that were just beginning to go soft at the crowns. He started the beans in the late afternoon, the way his mother had taught him, soak too long is better than not long enough, and cut the onions until his eyes ran. Which he permitted because no one was watching. Clara came to the main house at dusk. She knocked at the door, which surprised him. He told her she didn't need to knock. "I'll knock," she said, "until I know the house." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at what he'd assembled. Without a word she moved to the counter, picked up the block of cornmeal, looked in the bowl, looked at the cast iron skillet. She glanced at him sidelong. "You got buttermilk?" "I got sweet milk." She made a sound that was not quite disapproval. "It'll do." She took over the cornbread without asking and without apology, and Cord stepped back and let her, because he was not a foolish man. She mixed the batter in the big clay bowl with quick, economic movements, added a pinch of sugar from a small paper twist she'd brought from her own stores. Set the skillet to heat on the iron with a knob of lard that sizzled and smoked just right. Thomas and June came in, faces and hands damp from the pump. They sat at the table with the careful quietness of children who had learned that being invisible sometimes kept them safe. Cord noticed the way Thomas kept one eye on his mother and one on the door. He did not comment on it. The supper was the best thing Cord had eaten in longer than he cared to admit. The beans were thick and peppery, the salt pork soft and smoky, the cornbread with a crust that crackled and a center that held its steam like a good thing holding on to warmth. June ate 3 pieces of cornbread. Thomas ate 2 bowls of beans and then looked guilty about it, as if abundance was something to apologize for. "You eat," Cord told him. "There's more." Thomas looked at his mother. She gave one small nod. He ladled a 3rd bowl. Nobody spoke much. But the silence had a different quality to it than the silence Cord usually ate in, that long, grey silence of a man alone at a table that used to seat 3. This silence had weight and breath and the small sounds of people becoming slightly less afraid. When the dishes were cleared, Clara stood at the window and looked out at the dark where the corral was. Cord could see Ezra moving, a shadow among shadows. "I'll start with him tomorrow," she said. "Early. He'll try to put you over the fence." "Let him try," she said, and went back to the bunkhouse with her children. Cord sat at the table for a long time after, looking at the 3 extra plates he'd washed and stacked on the sideboard. He could not have explained why he felt less like a man in an empty house than he had in years. She began with Ezra at first light, before the sun had gotten its full meanness up. Cord watched from the barn doorway, doing the useful work of pretending to mend a bridle while actually watching everything. Clara entered the corral with a coiled rope over one shoulder and nothing else, no crop, no halter, no weapon of any kind. She moved to the center of the enclosure and stopped, and she did not look at the horse. This was the thing that made Cord set down the bridle. Ezra came at her in his sideways, testing way, nostrils going, ears back, hooves quartering the ground. She did not move. She stood with her weight balanced and her eyes directed at the middle distance, as if the horse were a conversation she was willing to have on his terms. The horse circled her once. Twice. On the third pass he slowed. By the time Thomas appeared at the corral fence with 2 tin mugs of coffee, the boy had gotten up early and made it himself on the bunkhouse stove. And the gesture landed on Cord harder than it should have. Ezra had dropped his head 6 inches and was blowing softly through his nose. "She does that," Thomas said, handing Cord the mug. "With all of them." "She's done this before," Cord said. It was not a question. Our old place, had 12 horses. The boy's voice went flat on the last part, the way land goes flat before a storm front. "She gentled most of them herself." Cord drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly burned, and it was the best coffee he'd had in months, not because of the coffee but because of how it arrived. Over the following days, the ranch began to change in small ways that Cord noticed but did not comment on, because commenting on them felt like the wrong kind of attention. The broken window latch on the east bedroom was fixed, not by him, with a bent nail worked clever and a piece of leather strap. The heap of old rope in the barn was coiled and hung properly. The hinge on the chicken coop, which had been dragging for 2 seasons, was reset with new screws and a small square of tin to reinforce the plate. Thomas did the fence work without being asked. He was methodical and serious about it, checking each post for wobble, replacing staples, keeping the wire tight. He worked the way people work when they have been taught that a property well maintained is a property worth keeping. June followed Cord. She did this without explanation or permission, simply appearing at his left elbow whenever he moved from task to task, watching what he did with intense focus. Occasionally asking questions that required him to think. "Why do you put the hay on top and not underneath?" "Because the animals eat down." "You always feed from the top so they have to reach and the older hay falls to the floor and you clear it." She considered this. "That's smart," she said, with the gravity of a person bestowing a meaningful honor. He found himself explaining things, the water rotation system, the way to read cloud cover in the territory, why you grain a horse after work and not before. She listened with total concentration and remembered everything. He learned she was 7 only in years. In watchfulness she was considerably older. By Thursday of the first week, Ezra allowed a halter. 40 miles south and east, in a town called Breckett where the main street had 3 saloons and 1 church and the church was losing, a man named Roy Voss was asking questions. He was not a large man, which sometimes surprised people who met him. He had a neat appearance, his boots were always clean, his hat was a good one, his coat fit properly. He had a careful, measured way of speaking that people often mistook for reasonableness. The mistake didn't last, but by the time it was corrected, he had usually gotten what he needed. He sat at the bar of the middle saloon with a whiskey he'd been nursing for an hour, and he was talking to the barkeep in his reasonable voice about the roads north. "Wagon tracks on the Cimarron Road," he said. "Single axle, light load. Woman driving, I'd expect." The barkeep, whose name was Pruitt and who owed Roy Voss money and therefore owed him loyalty by extension, did not look up from the glass he was polishing. "Couldn't say." "No," Roy agreed pleasantly. "I expect you couldn't." He set his glass down. "But the fellow at the Cimarron relay station said he saw a woman and 2 children headed north 4 days ago. Said the wagon had a canvas with a tear on the left side." Pruitt polished the glass. "A man's wife," Roy said, his voice going softer, "and his children, ought to be home. That's a matter of family. That's a legal matter, in some respects." "I suppose it might be," Pruitt said, in the careful tone of a man trying to be neither helpful nor unhelpful. Roy Voss laid a coin on the bar for the whiskey, then laid another beside it. "I'll be riding north in the morning," he said. "If you hear anything." He left the saloon and stood on the board sidewalk in the cooling evening air and looked north along the road the way a man looks at something he fully intends to reclaim. The town of Arroyo Seco was not large enough to have secrets, only rumors, which were the same thing with ambition. Cord went in on Saturday for supplies, as he always did, with the wagon and the dun mare who was aging but reliable, and Clara came with him. Which he had proposed and he had agreed to without extensive discussion. Thomas stayed back with June, which Thomas had proposed and Cord had agreed to with a look at Thomas that said clearly, "You are in charge of this property and I am trusting you." Thomas had stood 3 inches taller. The feed store was first. Mervyn Dodds was behind the counter, a man constructed from spare parts, 2 long arms, 2 short neck, eyebrows that did most of his communicating. He watched Cord and Clara come through the door together with eyebrows that immediately had a great deal to say. "Hallett," he said. "Heard you had company." "Order some cornmeal," Cord said. £50. "And whatever she needs." He stepped back. Clara moved to the counter with her list. She had written it in a small, precise hand. And she went through it item by item with the focused economy of a person who knew the price of everything and would accept no substitutions without mathematical justification. Mervyn watched her with a complex expression that was composed of curiosity, a trace of admiration, and something that was deciding which direction to go. He went sideways. "You're the Voss woman," he said. "From the Braddock spread." "Voss is my married name," Clara said, without stopping writing down the quantity of coffee she needed. "I was born Clara Braddock." "Your father was Amos Braddock," Mervyn said. "He was." "Good man." "He was," she said again, the same words, a different weight. "And the property," Mervyn began. "The property is a legal matter I'm attending to," Clara said. "Sack of dried pinto beans, £20. Mervyn wrote it down, but not without another slide of the eyebrows in Cord's direction. Cord found a spot near the window that needed looking at. The real difficulty came outside, at the water trough on the main street. Where Cord was watering the dun mare, and a woman named Harriet Fales arrived with the specific momentum of a person who has been building toward a conversation for several days. Harriet Fales was the wife of Edwin Fales, who was on the town council and owned the only hardware concern in Arroyo Seco, which gave the Fales family a social altitude that Harriet defended like a military position. She was not a cruel woman, precisely. She was a woman who believed that the order of things was important, and that the order of things included knowing what the arrangement was between a widowed man and a woman living on his property. "Cord Hallett," she said, arriving at the trough. "I'd heard you'd taken on a housekeeper." "Ranch hand," Cord said. Harriet Fales blinked. "Beg pardon?" "Ranch hand," he said again, offering the mare a moment to finish. "I needed someone who knew horses." "She knows horses." "She's a woman," Harriet said, as if this might be information he lacked. "I'd noticed." Harriet adjusted the weight of her market basket on her arm. "Cord. People are talking. A woman living on your property, in your bunkhouse, with children. You must see how it what," he said. He was not aggressive. His voice was level and genuinely curious, the way a man is curious about a problem he doesn't find particularly complicated. Harriet colored. "How it appears." "To who?" "To the town. To respectable people." "Mrs. Fales," Cord said, "I've got cattle to water and fence to run and a horse that near killed 3 men. Mrs. Voss has got skills I need and children she's providing for. That's the arrangement." He turned to go. "Her husband," Harriet said sharply, "is Roy Voss. You know that name." Cord turned back slowly. Harriet had the tight, unhappy look of a person who has played their best card out of sequence. "He was through here last spring. Did some business with Edwin. He's a particular kind of man." "What kind?" "The kind," she said carefully, "that doesn't let go of things he considers his." Cord looked at her for a long moment, measuring the earnestness in it, deciding it was genuine under the social friction. "I appreciate that," he said, and meant it enough that Harriet Fales looked slightly surprised. When he found Clara at the dry goods store, she had the particular stillness of a woman who had just come through her own version of an unpleasant conversation. The proprietor's wife, a Mrs. Denny, was rearranging bolts of cloth that did not need rearranging. "Ready?" Cord asked. "Ready," Clara said. They loaded the wagon without speaking. As they pulled out of town onto the northward road, the mountains ahead of them catching the afternoon light at an angle that turned them the color of dark copper, Clara said. She asked me how long I intended to stay. Who did? Mrs. Denny. Cord clicked the mare forward. What did you tell her? I told her as long as I was needed. He nodded once. The road ran out ahead of them straight as a thought. Roy Voss, he said. Not a question. Clara's hands folded in her lap. Yes. He'll come. Yes. Then we've got some things to think about, Cord said. The mare's hooves kept their steady beat against the packed dirt road, and the mountains watched everything. And neither of them spoke again until the ranch came into view and Thomas appeared at the fence, waving once to show that all was well. He set a lamp in the window of the main house every night, not on the sill where it could be seen from the road, but set back, giving the room a low amber fill that meant occupied, alert, present. He was not sure when he had started doing this. The second night, he thought. Maybe the first. His rifle was an 1876 Winchester centerfire, a gun he'd shot enough to trust and cleaned enough to respect. He kept it at the foot of his bed, loaded, hammer down. On the 12th night after Clara and the children had arrived, a sound woke him that was not quite a sound, more of an absence. The night birds had stopped. The frogs along the ditch that always ran their low, wet conversation until 3 in the morning had gone quiet. Cord was sitting up before he was fully awake, his hand already on the Winchester. He did not light the lamp. He went to the window in his sock feet and looked out. The moon was in its third quarter, thin but enough. The corral was still. Ezra was standing at the far end of the enclosure, not pacing, not asleep, standing the way a horse stands when it has perceived something and is deciding whether to be afraid. A man was at the bunkhouse door. Not knocking. Not calling out. Standing with his hand on the latch in the particular posture of a man testing whether a thing is locked. Cord went out the back of the main house barefoot, moving on the packed earth of the yard with the careful slowness that 17 years on this land had given him. He knew every rock. Every soft patch, every place the ground changed under his feet. He came around the water tank and along the back wall of the bunkhouse in complete silence, the Winchester carried level. The man at the door heard him anyway. He turned, and in the thin moonlight Cord got a look at him, not Roy Voss but younger, hired, with the flat expression of a man doing contracted work. He wore a coat too heavy for the season, which explained certain things about the shape under his left arm. This is private property, Cord said. The man held very still. He had the sense, Cord noted, not to reach anywhere. I'm looking for a woman, the man said. And 2 children. I'm acting on behalf of their family. You're on my property at midnight with your hand on my hired hand's door, Cord said. I don't hear anything that sounds like family in that. Roy Voss has legal claim. Roy Voss has no legal claim on my property, Cord said. You can carry that word back to him. A long silence. An owl called somewhere in the dark mesquite along the fence line, came to its own conclusions, went quiet. He won't take that as an answer, the man said. He doesn't have to take it as anything, Cord said. It's not offered for his comfort. Now you get on your horse, I expect it's at the south gate, because that's where I would have tied it, and you ride back to wherever Roy Voss is sitting and you tell him what I said. Exactly. The man adjusted his coat, carefully, making certain his hands were visible throughout. He walked to the south gate. Cord had been right about the horse, and he mounted and he rode south without looking back. Cord stood in the yard for a long time after, until the night birds came back and the frogs resumed their argument along the ditch. The bunkhouse door opened. Clara stood in it with a short-barreled shotgun that Cord had not known she had and did not ask about. How long were you standing there? He asked. Since before you came around the water tank, she said. He thought about that. You could have, it wasn't my place to, she said. It's your property. Clara. He said her name with the weight it had accumulated over 12 days. You got children in that room. I know what I got in that room, she said, and there was nothing soft in it. It was the hardest thing he'd heard her say, hard the way iron is hard, the kind of hard that has been worked in fire. He'll come himself next time, Cord said. I know. We need to be smarter than him. She looked at him for a moment across the dark yard, 10 feet of packed earth between them, the thin moon doing what it could. What are you proposing? I don't know yet, he said honestly. But I'm going to figure it out. She nodded once. She went back inside. The bunkhouse door closed. Cord stood in the yard until the sky in the east began its slow graying. Thinking about law and property and the way certain men moved through the world like weather, inevitable and indifferent and violent. He went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with paper and the stub of a pencil and began to write down everything he knew about legal standing in the New Mexico territory. Which was less than he wished and more than he expected. On Monday morning, Cord rode to Arroyo Seco alone. He left at first light with a folded paper in his breast pocket, Ezra, fully haltered now, beginning to accept the saddle pad, watching from the corral with those dark, suspicious eyes. Thomas was at the fence. I'll be back before supper, Cord told him. Thomas looked at the road south, then at Cord. Should I keep June inside today? Cord looked at the boy. 11 years old, with a man's responsibility already settled on his shoulders like something that had been set there too young and worn in too deep to come off clean. Keep her close, Cord said. Not scared. Just close. Yes, sir. He rode to town and went first to the office of Elias Pruitt. Who was the closest thing Arroyo Seco had to a proper attorney and who operated out of a 2-room adobe behind the hardware store. Pruitt was a thin man of 50 with ink-stained fingers and a habit of tapping his knee when he was working through a problem. Cord laid out the situation plainly. Clara Braddock, née Voss by marriage, had left her husband Roy Voss under circumstances that included, he chose his words, documented cause. The Braddock property 3 miles northeast had been her father's. Her father had died 2 years prior and the property had passed by informal arrangement to Roy Voss, whose name appeared on no legal deed, as Cord had reason to believe. Pruitt's knee-tapping increased. You have reason to believe, he said. Based on what? Cord unfolded the paper from his breast pocket and laid it on the desk. It was a letter. Clara had written it at the kitchen table the night before, in that small, precise hand, while June slept on the bench seat beside her with her head on her mother's leg. It detailed the property arrangement, the absence of any deed transfer, and her own standing as Amos Braddock's only living child and heir. Pruitt read it twice. His knee slowed. This is her statement, he said. It is. Roy Voss will dispute it. Roy Voss can dispute whatever he wants in front of a proper land court, Cord said. What I want to know is whether there's any legal instrument I can file today, in this office, that makes Clara Voss and her children legally resident on my property with my explicit written consent. Such that any man who comes onto this land after dark without my leave is trespassing under territorial law. Pruitt looked at him over the letter. I can file a declaration of occupancy and employment, he said slowly. It's not airtight against a husband's claim in all courts, but under territorial statute, if there is evidence of, he paused, of hazard to the party in question. There are protections. File it, Cord said. There is also, Pruitt said, his voice going carefully neutral, the way lawyers' voices go when they are about to say something that requires the other party to make a decision. A more permanent instrument. Say it plainly. Marriage, Pruitt said. If Mrs. Voss were to marry again, if she were a married woman, on your property, with her name on a deed, Roy Voss's marital claim dissolves entirely under territorial law. He'd have nothing to contest. The room was quiet. Outside, someone was driving a wagon down the main street and the iron-rimmed wheels were loud on the dried earth. That's a significant proposal, Cord said. I'm not proposing it, Pruitt said. I'm describing the legal landscape. Cord looked at his hands for a moment. They were the hands of a rancher, scarred, square, honest in their ugliness. He thought about a woman who knocked on doors until she knew the house. A boy who made coffee in the morning without being asked. A girl who thought a horse that bit was a good horse. File the declaration of occupancy, he said. Today. I'll come back about the rest. He rode back to the ranch and found Clara at the corral with Ezra. The stallion now accepting the saddle pad and a light girth with something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it. She had one hand on the horse's neck, flat-palmed, and she was talking to him in a low voice that Cord could not hear the words of, only the tone, steady, even, completely without fear. He sat the dun mare at the gate and watched until she turned. He told her what Pruitt had said. All of it. He laid it out without editorializing, the declaration of occupancy, the marital instrument, the legal landscape, as Pruitt had called it. He did not tell her what he felt. He was not yet certain enough of the precise taxonomy of it to name it out loud, and he thought naming it prematurely would be a kind of dishonesty. Clara listened without expression. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds, long enough that Cord counted them. The declaration of occupancy, she said. That's filed. Being filed this afternoon. She nodded. And the other? That's a separate question, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She looked back at Ezra, then at Cord. I will think about it as a legal question, she said carefully, entirely separate from any other question. That's fair, he said. But, she paused, and for the first time in 2 weeks, something came to the surface of her expression that she had been keeping carefully submerged. It was not simple, what it was. It had sorrow in it and wariness in it and something underneath both of those things that was warm and very old and had not been allowed out in a long time. I would want it to be a real thing, she said quietly. If it was done. I would not want it to be only a legal instrument. The statement landed in the yard between them like something fragile set down very gently. No, Cord said. Neither would I. Roy Voss arrived in Arroyo Seco on Wednesday with 2 men riding alongside him and the careful, pleasant expression of a man who did not yet know he had already lost. He went to Pruitt's office first, because he was a man who understood the sequence of legal challenge, how establish the claim, apply pressure through proper channels. Position yourself for the righteous recovery of what belongs to you. He had done this before. He was very good at it. What he had not accounted for was that Pruitt had filed the declaration of occupancy on Monday, as promised, and had additionally, on his own initiative. With the particular quiet indignation of a lawyer who has decided that the law exists for a reason, sent a rider to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe with a request for a full deed inquiry into the Braddock property. The inquiry had come back with unusual speed, because the Territorial Land Office happened to have the original Amos Braddock homestead deed on file, the one from 1863. With Amos's daughter Clara named as secondary heir. Roy Voss sat in Pruitt's office and heard this explained to him by a man whose knee was completely, magnificently still. You're saying, Roy said, in his careful reasonable voice, that she has legal claim to her father's property. I'm saying the deed is clear, Pruitt said. And that a contested claim would need to go before a territorial judge, which is a 6-month process, during which time Mrs. Voss's status on the Hallett property is legally protected under the Declaration of Occupancy. Roy looked at Pruitt with the expression of a man recalibrating. She's not Mrs. Hallett. Not yet, Pruitt said, with the neutrality of a man holding good cards. The word landed the way it was intended to. Roy Voss left Pruitt's office and went to the saloon and sat with his whiskey and thought about what he was looking at. He was looking at a woman who had found solid ground. He was looking at a lawyer who had done his job thoroughly. He was looking at a rancher who had stood in a yard with a Winchester at midnight and not been moved, and who was apparently prepared to not be moved in courtrooms as well. He was looking at a door that had closed. By Thursday, Roy Voss and his 2 men were riding south. Harriet Fales saw them go from the window of her husband's hardware store. She watched the road after they'd passed until it settled back to dust and silence. Then she went to the dry goods store and bought a small jar of lemon drops. She drove them out to the Hallett place herself, because she was also a woman who understood that a thing done should be done properly. She left them on the fence post with a note that said only, for the children. Cord found them at sundown. He brought them inside and set them on the table without comment. June saw them first. "What are those?" she asked. "Lemon drops," Cord said. "Who left them?" "A neighbor." June picked up the jar and examined it with scholarly interest. "Are we allowed neighbors now?" she asked. Clara, at the stove, made a sound that was the first thing Cord had heard from her that was entirely uncomplicated, clear and sudden as water over stone. It was a laugh. Brief, startled out of her, real. Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending at the table. He looked at his mother's face, and something in his own face, something he had been holding very tightly for a very long time, let go by a small but visible degree. "I believe we are," Cord said. 3 weeks later. On a Thursday morning in October, when the light was the color of hammered brass and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and the air had in it for the first time the first cool edge of autumn. Cord Hallett and Clara Braddock were married in Pruitt's office with Thomas and June as witnesses and Mervyn Dodds from the feed store standing in as a second witness because Pruitt needed two. Mervyn's eyebrows were, for once, entirely composed. Clara wore the dress she'd had in the wagon, plain, dark, good wool, altered at the hem with small even stitches that Cord noticed because he noticed the work she put into things. She had braided her hair. There was a sprig of late-season chamomile tucked above her ear that June had put there with the grave authority of a person executing an important commission. When Pruitt asked the words, Clara answered them in a clear, quiet voice. Cord answered in the same way. He was not a man for large declarations. Neither was she. What they exchanged in that office was not romance exactly, not as novels described it, it was something older and more solid than that. It was the decision, made by two people who had been broken by different things in different ways, to build something in the place the breaking had left. It was practical and deliberate, and it was, underneath all that, the most honest thing either of them had done in years. Afterward, Mervyn shook Cord's hand and looked at Clara with his eyebrows in a configuration that was unmistakably respectful. "Your father was a good man," he said. "He was," Clara said. The same words. A different weight altogether. By the first snowfall, Ezra would accept a rider. Not just any rider, Clara only, for the first month. Then Thomas. Then, on a cold November morning with the ground iron hard and the mountains wearing their first white like something dignified, Cord himself. The horse stood for him. That was all. Just stood, and breathed, and allowed. Cord sat in the saddle for a long moment without asking the animal for anything. The ranch lay below them, the repaired bunkhouse, now converted to a proper second house, the new chicken coop with its rehung door, the fence line running true and tight. Smoke from the main house chimney. The smell of something good on the stove carrying even across the cold air. Thomas at the fence, watching. June somewhere he could not see, which did not worry him anymore. There are lives that break clean, that shatter all at once in a single moment, and the pieces are identifiable and you know what you lost. And there are lives that break slowly, the way old timber goes, quietly, under accumulated weight. Until one day there is more absence than structure and you have forgotten what the whole thing looked like. The second kind of breaking is harder to name and harder to come back from, because you cannot point to the day it happened. You can only point to the day you noticed the light was different, warmer, somehow, coming through the window. You can only notice that the table has 4 plates on it now and that this feels, improbably, like exactly the right number. Healing is not a dramatic thing, most of the time. It is a woman who knocks on the door until she knows the house. It is a boy making coffee before he is asked. It is a small girl asking sensible questions about horses and trusting the answers. It is a man who stands in a yard at midnight and does not move, because some things are worth the standing. The broken places, if you tend them right, grow back harder than what was there before. Not unmarked. Not as if the breaking never happened. But stronger in the cracks, the way old wood is stronger where it has been repaired, denser, more deliberate, knowing its own weight. The horse moved beneath him, finding his footing. Cord let him choose the direction. This has been a story about what it means to choose someone, not out of romance or desperation, but out of the deep, quiet conviction that some people are worth the standing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. And remember, the most important walls are the ones we choose to let people through.